It was Michael Pollan that encouraged, through his work, my 70-something parents to try psilocybin for the first time. And they're going to love what I did. Bob Jesse is a guiding force behind the contemporary reemergence of psychedelics. In the mid-1990s, he convened an expert group, the Council on Spiritual Practices, which was instrumental in forming the psilocybin research team at Johns Hopkins. Currently, he continues to advise and collaborate in the psychedelic space, and folks, I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Michael Pollan and Bob Jesse to the stage.
This conversation. So I want to just give you a little background before we start. Bob, many of you know, Bob has played a very important role in what we call, although he doesn't love the term, the psychedelic renaissance. Behind the scenes for a very long time. I began this conversation with Bob back in 2014. I reached out to him when I was writing a piece for the New Yorker called The Trip Treatment, my first piece on the subject. And Bob decided I should be writing about psychedelics before I even thought about writing about psychedelics. But that's a whole other story. I went and interviewed him on his mountaintop cabin in his outdoor living room, and started a conversation then that has lasted just about 10 years. And we thought it would be interesting to let you in on that conversation and conduct it a little bit more in public. And talk about the kinds of things we talk about. One is language. Bob is very precise. I described him in How to Change Your Mind as choosing his words with a tweezer. And I'm the writer. He's much more careful about language than I am. And Bob came up with the name of this panel. So I thought maybe we'd start by this very interesting, complicated word called timbering, and why psychedelics need it.
Sure. First of all, it's great to be here with you. Michael, of course, has introduced the world to psychedelics in a way that I think no one else could have, including and Bob introduced psychedelics to me in a way no one else could have. Including that's not what I mean. Tempering, to temper. It's such an interesting, multifaceted word. In the vernacular, it usually means something like tone it down, that's enough, lower the volume. But it's got richer meanings as well. In material science and metallurgy, it means to strengthen something, to make it tougher. So it's a positive term. It's got a meaning in music, having to do with spacing of notes in a scale, where you space them for some desired musical effect. So I can find ways to map all of those onto psychedelics and how psychedelics are being discussed in contemporary society.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. I mean, we have come so far from that first conversation. You had been working for more than 10 years before then to bring psychedelics out of the cold and back into research, and you were instrumental in doing that. I don't know that you would have imagined a conference like this in the 1990s when we started. 13,000 people, evidently highly enthusiastic. And that in some ways this is your dream come true, the presentation of all this research and the number of informed people who are involved in what has really become a movement. On the other hand, rather than celebrating, you sound cautionary notes. And I'm kind of curious, and this is something we have talked about, in sort of what keeps you up at night when you think about how things are unfolding. What do you worry about?
On good nights, not much. and that's really a sign of faith that in the fullness of time things will work out. I think it's going to be a rocky road for some number of years. It'll be a little messy from time to time. we're trying as a culture, statewide, federally, decrim, deprioritization, take steps in a good direction, but we don't know what the best steps are going to be. So when I'm not losing sleep, it's just understanding there's no way this could be perfect. And so many people, including a lot of people in this room now, a lot of people in the conference, are working really hard to try to figure out what are good, reasonable, prudent steps forward. So that's the plus side. What interferes with a good night's sleep?
Do you see anything going wrong now, or do you worry about things going wrong that might go wrong?
Depends on where you focus. I'll start here. If you're an insider in the FDA or in the pharma world, these are professionals talking to professionals. They talk about a drug being safe and effective. That's just the term of art. But when a layperson hears that, it's easy to imagine that, it's as safe as water, and it always works. So when the pros say safe and effective, what they really mean is safe enough and effective enough given the condition that it's being used to treat. But that pretty much gets lost. Another example of inside terminology that leads to maybe an incorrect conclusion is what the FDA calls breakthrough therapy designation, which is given to a promising drug that seems to have the possibility of doing better than other drugs for the same indication. But if you're running a political campaign trying to decriminalize something or legalize something, then you can call it an FDA-designated breakthrough therapy. You're going to say that. But it leads the layperson to believe the wrong thing. If it were really a breakthrough therapy, the FDA would cease the trials and approve it today. So what it really means is a breakthrough therapy candidate. But the FDA didn't give us that word, and it doesn't show up in the public. So the concern here is the public, and this is a gross generalization, doesn't yet have a sophisticated enough or nuanced understanding that nothing is perfectly safe, nothing is perfectly efficacious, and it can still make all sense of the world to opt for that treatment or to opt for that thing. So I think we just need to grow our nuance.
Do you think we need to be talking more about risk?
I do. So these materials got locked in the deep freeze decades ago, demonized. Most people learn only just say negative things about them. Then suddenly the deep freeze starts to thaw, the clinical trials are happening, the randomized control trials are not clinical, and healthy normals, that's all happening, generates headlines, got your interest, you got what the message, you've included the risk. But sometimes that gets omitted. It shouldn't be hard to get to a place where we look at psychedelics, even kids growing up, understand psychedelics, including the risks, kind of like we do now with automobiles, or something like taking a strenuous hike up a slippery, rocky slope, or even rock climbing. Like, we're not shocked when somebody drives a car and there's a bad accident. We can be grievous about it, but we can also be grateful that cars have gotten safer, airbags have gotten safer, highways have gotten safer, the signs have gotten better, and still there's a risk of driving to the grocery store. I don't think we fully have that yet about psychedelics.
Of course, we mitigate those risks with regulation in the case of the cars. We don't do that with rock climbing or hiking. But my take is that we should talk more about risk. And in my own experience, I wrote a book that was fairly enthusiastic about psychedelics. And when I started talking to people about it, and I was in rooms big or small with civilians, who's mostly who I talked to, I noticed that this interesting phenomenon, which was that there would always be someone or some category of person in the room, and it was very often a woman in her 20s or 30s who had children at home, who would clench up. I could almost feel it or see it as I was talking about the potential of psychedelics to heal and all the positive things they could do. And I realized she wasn't hearing anything I said because she had heard a lot about risk. And a lot of it was bullshit. I mean, a lot of it was kind of urban myths and things. People jumping in the windows, that kind of story. But others were things that really, and people have jumped out of windows, it's important to point out. And I learned that, though, if I change my strategy and I talk about risk at the beginning, she would listen. This person would listen and open her ears. And I thought that was a very interesting lesson, that you have more credibility the more you talk about the negatives of something. And of course, our society is not organized to do that. And political campaigns are a great case of that. What's your take on that, on how we talk about psychedelics when we're trying to get them decriminalized or legalized?
I think about that in a very small personal scale, any number of points along a big scale, and then on large scales. A small scale could be, I'm talking to somebody in my extended family who I think maybe could benefit from the psychedelic experience, and I'm kind of making a commitment going forward. By the way, I'm so grateful for people being here, for all the work that's brought us to this day, including the private conversations, the psychedelic clubs, the political activities, all of it. It's gotten us to just quite an unbelievably awesome place, yeah? So what I'm doing for myself is drawing a line and saying, all the things that got us to today, great. But I personally want to do some things a little differently going forward. When I have that conversation with a family member, I think I want to make sure to include the risk. I don't know whether or not to lead with it. That would depend on the person and whether we need to. But all I say is, in a day, you can have 10,000 hours of psychotherapy. I'm not going to say that. By the way, it wasn't that long ago that an investor said that on an important stage being interviewed by a famous person. Psilocybin, 10,000 hours of psychotherapy happened before. That's not helpful. You might say a lot of people find psilocybin to be extremely helpful, like shockingly helpful. Other people have found their experience to be helpful, but mediumly so. A few people don't really respond positively, and we don't know the numbers. Occasionally people are apparently set back. And if you really dig down into the small numbers, there are levels of impairment and duration of the impairment that are really pretty serious. So I want my relative to know that. And notice that took, 30 seconds? So we don't have to go deeply into the weeds. How about a talk at a psychedelic society or any group setting? Well, you can do the same thing. You can make sure that you get on the incredibly positive stuff that science is showing. But even today's most positive results, whether MDMA trials, psilocybin trials, they don't work for everyone. And usually when we pass the word along, we accentuate the positive. Well, let's just tell the other side of the equation. We're going to jump ahead all the way to political campaigns. So it's one thing if it's a small-scale political campaign in the city, it's kind of grassroots. When you get to bigger levels, like a state-level initiative, these are well-orchestrated campaigns run by very skilled professionals, and often they start with focus groups and polling to figure out what is the message to get the thing passed. They know they're dealing with voters who don't have a lot of attention to spare, so they might get, I can give this up, 10 seconds of attention before the voter will have to decide yes, no, or neither. That's it. Those are the only three choices. So when you're in that kind of a situation, you're going to generate messaging that not only accentuates the positive, but only states the positive. It'll be a video. Psilocybin changed my life. My family is so much happier now. Please vote yes on measure 1, 2, 3. I think the time for that might be over. There's a different game to try, and I can't predict the outcome. What would happen if the best messaging people could somehow figure out how to include a more comprehensive message? It does not have to get deeply into the weeds, but just let voters know that this is not as easy as it seems, and on balance, this still seems like a wonderful thing to approve. So it could be. It could be that the polling would show if you say that, you're going to lose. You've got a choice. We're going to spend the money, run the experiment, but maybe the electorate will rise to the occasion. Or that be prepared to spend the money and lose, and try again later. If it looks like an unattractive proposition, you can say, let's not go to the voters. Let's go to the state legislatures, which these days seem to be many of them very eager to enter the help of the psychedelic realm. And in the context of the legislature, there's room for nuance. It's messy, doesn't work perfectly, but there's room for nuance, especially in committee.
Nuance has seldom survived the American political process. But I mean, it's an excellent idea, and you can argue one of two things. I mean, if you overhype something, you may sell some people in the short term, but you lose credibility when something goes wrong. And something will go wrong. I think we have to acknowledge that it's inevitable. The number of people who are using psychedelics in a number of different contexts, things are going to go wrong. And as a journalist, I know at a certain point, the only article on psychedelics you can sell will be the most negative article. We saw that in the 1960s. There was a moment where press that had been incredibly positive, I mean, led by Time and Life and all the major publications of that period, they couldn't run a negative story about psychedelics for many years. And then suddenly, in 1965, a switch was thrown, and you couldn't run a positive article anymore. They were all negative. And because some certain things had happened, and people weren't prepared for it, and it made them doubt everything they'd heard earlier. So I think there is an enormous gain in credibility by talking about risk and talking about openly about problems. And I'm particularly interested in that as a journalist, and the role of journalism in this space. Another venue of my conversation with Bob is in the offices of the Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics. Bob is an invaluable advisor to us. And one of the things we're doing at that center is a lot of public education. Massive online course, a newsletter, The Microdose. And if you look at and a bunch of journalism fellows that were funded by Tim Ferriss, who we just saw earlier. And we think very hard about tone of the journalism we're doing. And have opted, I think you'll see if you look at it, for a tone that you might describe as sober and not evangelical in any way. And, it may not be as exciting sometimes, but I think in the long run, it'll be more credible. And when things do go wrong, the public will be somewhat prepared for it. And I think that's important. So it becomes a kind of inoculation.
And it's not only when things go wrong, it's understanding things, whether they're easily categorized as right or wrong, with another level of detail. So I think of it as educational, and we all can learn. And I think the leaders of the Microdose are willing to learn, and happy to do so in bite-sized chunks.
Yeah. Bob, on a volunteer basis, reads every issue of the Microdose before it comes out, and brings his tweezer out, and makes sure we do not exaggerate, and we do not misrepresent in any way. It's invaluable service.
Yeah, it's fun to do. I want to go back just one step to political campaigns and whether or not you can tell a full story and still win.
Yeah.
And the hometown people here will appreciate this. So Denver was the first city to decriminalize, or more properly deprioritize, the laws against suicide with mushrooms. I'm getting chills. What an awesome activity, and great that you guys did that. Pretty early on, I reached out to the team doing that, led by Kevin Matthews, and we reviewed the website with the intention of tempering some of the claims. So I'm going to exaggerate both the starting place and the ending point. The exaggerated start place is Johns Hopkins proves psilocybin cures depression. End of story. Exaggerating the tempered version is small scale, small n, preliminary studies that show promise, we can even say great promise, in helping to treat depression, in some people. That's scrupulous language. So they work out something in between that gets some of the nuance. Then we had a conversation about, the website talks about all the great clinical trial results so far, but it doesn't mention that it doesn't work for everyone, and there are downsides. So do you guys want to do anything about that? I said, Kevin, I don't want you to lose. In my view, there's no room for handcuffs for growing, possessing, and giving away psilocybin mushrooms. So I want you to win. But there's another side of the story. Think about it. So we had a conversation a week later, said, I've talked with my team about this. And we decided we want to tell the whole story. We think it will increase our credibility. We think it's going to help us. But if it doesn't help us, we're willing to lose. And if we lose, we'll try again in a couple of years. I would love to see more of that attitude. There was a debate earlier this week between two well-known people in the field. One is very kind of progressive and go fast, and the other is slow down, we don't know a lot yet. And I was caught in the replay of this conversation that's been going on for a decade or more. Caught in that duality. And then a little light bulb went off. The right question is not how fast or how slow. Maybe the right question is how. So what happens if a political campaign tells the whole story and the voters say no thank you? The voters, that election, have set pace. So we leave the how fast, how slow to larger forces, and our part of the how is scrupulous disclosure. What do you think?
I think it's exactly right. I think it needs to build these campaigns, and I think that's not necessarily so bad. I mean, we are moving very quickly, and there are good reasons to move quickly, and there are good reasons not to. And some people are of two minds on this. Someone very close to both of us whose name I can say, is Roland Griffith, who talks a lot about, he talked this morning about being very careful and going very slow and letting things unfold over hundreds of years, I believe he said. At the same time, he's also on record saying, and said this morning, that we may need psychedelics to save the species. And we are in an existential crisis. This is an emergency. Whether you're talking about climate change or various technological threats. So how do you weigh those two? I think that's a really hard issue. And you're saying, let's not worry about speed, let's just act with integrity now.
That's my different
call that they think.
That's right. Complete integrity, educate at whatever level you can. There will be uptake. By the way, I'm in favor of letting adults make what may prove to be mistakes. We'll learn from that too.
Oh, and I think mistakes are really important. I mean, what I see going on is a very fertile, exciting set of experiments. And Oregon is an experiment. There's a very exciting experiment. Colorado will be another experiment. I think we should see how they turn out, though, before we do 10 other Oregons, because there may be another way to do it. And that I think it's very important that we approach this, because no one knows. No one knows what's going to happen or what should happen exactly. So we have to iterate and learn from our mistakes, and then try again in a different way. An experiment I'm really excited about is sunstone therapies. You know about them. This is a cancer clinic, an oncology clinic in Bethesda, Maryland, that has started doing psychedelic therapy, offering it. They figured out a way to do 4 sessions at once not with 8 guys, but with 5 guys, one watching what the others do. There was a little clip on it in the Netflix series. And there's something that really is working nicely here. And also, oncology clinics turns out to be a perfect place, better than a behavioral health place, to do psychedelics, because they're used to handling dangerous drugs or hazardous drugs. They have lots of different levels of from nurse to nurse practitioner to doctors, and they handle tons of paperwork routinely, which is going to be a big part of this. So that's a really interesting and important experiment. And I think we should be supporting and funding those kinds of things, and kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom until we learn what works. So that's kind of how I see it. And with the understanding that some experiments are going to absolutely fail, And certainly we've seen that in the corporate world, right? We already have this giant shakeout. The amount of investment money that has been lost, that's been bet on psychedelics and lost, those experiments have, gone belly up. And that's fine. I mean, that's the way it should work. There's a warning of a severe thunderstorm at 3:45. We'll be done by then, running that way.
Or up or down.
So, any questions for me?
Yeah. What do you think about the term psychedelic renaissance, especially when the R is capitalized?
Especially with what?
When the R is
Capitalized. I think it's fine. Here's how I understand psychedelic renaissance. The Renaissance is not just a period of like everything's great and flowering and culture. It was a period of relearning, of recovery, of lost knowledge. And I think it's one of the most interesting things about what's going on today is that a lot of the experiments we're doing were already done in the 1950s and 60s. I mean, the religious leaders study is in a way, is a replication of the Good Friday experiment. Well, it's cited in, in a lot of the discussions of it. Steve Ross, I remember when I interviewed him, he's a PI at NYU, was talking about how he's a psychiatrist, how he had to excavate all this knowledge about the use of LSD to treat alcoholism when he was designing studies of alcoholism. So to the extent that what's happening now is new in some ways, but very old in other ways, Renaissance is a good word. What's your problem?
Question back.
And what would be a better word?
Okay.
Here come the tweezers. Wow.
So the emotional tenor of the word Renaissance, especially when capitalized to me, is this huge, broad, cultural flourishing, arts and music and philosophy. It isn't just uncovering dusty old publications, even though that might have been part of the early Renaissance. What would be better? I'm trying to read myself. I kind of jumped on that bandwagon unthinkingly a long time ago and would occasionally say psychedelic Renaissance. But I would prefer to leave that term for historians a long time from now to apply to this period if they think it fits. In the meanwhile, how about reemergence? Reemergence of psychedelics or rediscovery of the old psychedelic research.
Renaissance without the re.
There's a re. It's a rediscovery or a resumption. Anyhow, I feel like capitalize Renaissance only because it seems to add to hype. It seems to overpromise. Even if you can point to technically correct interpretations of it, it elevates our hope, which is a good thing. We all need hope. But let's temper it.
Fair enough. Something that's been a really important part of your work, and not necessarily the fields till recently, has been, the main path we mostly talk about, or the media mostly talks about, on which psychedelics will enter culture, mainstream culture, is the medical path, right? We talk about FDA approval of MDMA and psilocybin after that, and it is through American medicine that this is how we will bring psychedelics into culture. But there is another path, too, and you've been very involved in that from the beginning. You formed an organization called the Council on Spiritual Practices, not medical practices. And there is now a lot of activity along that path. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about what you see happening there, what encourages you and what worries you about that.
It's a very rich question, a very rich area. I'll back up a little bit by saying that at some point earlier in my life, I had to reorient myself to the word religion. I grew up in a very nominally religious household, church-going for a while, singing in the choir until I stopped, because I started paying attention to the creed I was expected to say and did not say it. And I broke off from religion. And it wasn't until considerably later that I realized that maybe I had thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And actually, there's a lot there that's really precious and beautiful and timeless. So I have an interest in what we might think of as the phenomenon of religion, not so much a particular religion, is recovering what may have gotten thrown out, at least by some of us. Within that is the notion of religious community, which you could say community, but if there's a community of people who are mutually engaged in even their own independently driven form of personal, psychological, even spiritual exploration, but doing it in community, I'm going to say that's the beginnings of something that has a religious flavor to it. So, back up even more. The psychedelics were made illegal. Use went underground. This would have been before the ayahuasca, spotlight on ayahuasca, lots of people doing South America, bringing it through here. The psychedelics were never forgotten. They went underground, largely being used by friend groups. And some of these friend groups were characterized by people who get together once in a while, a couple times a year, park, somebody's home, take psychedelics, get to profound places, either during or after, talk about that with each other. It may prompt somebody to say, wow, that's really cool. I read this book, I think you would like it. Here's a copy. Well, that's kind of a form of integration. So people are developing psychologically, spiritually, bonding together. And I want to say that that's not a flavor of a vital, growing religion. Not with a name religion, but it's a religious social activity. We now have a new crop of psychedelic churches. And I'm going to break them into two camps, but the dividing line is not at all clear. Some of them are groups of people with a long-received tradition, or developing their own tradition, who are actually regularizing their practice. They get together on a particular calendar. They've decided on a forum for taking the material that they like. They have other activities that are not substance-related. And they think of it as a church. To them, it's really their church. It's their synagogue community, or whatever. And I think they're going to continue to grow organically. If ever push came to shove with the authorities, they will be able to say, look at our developmental history. We might be a young church, but it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, looks like a duck. We think it's a duck, but it's our duck. There's another group, another kind of group, of people who've decided that there's this thing called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. How do we get us some of that? Well, the answer is we print up cards that say church. And you can get one for $75. I got something in my pocket going on. And I'm wary of that. Not that I think handcuffs are the answer. I'm sorry if the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is the only stay out of jail free card available now. I wish that were true. And maybe some of these groups will actually find that they grow into something that's a stable, multi-generational set of traditions that would warrant being called a church or a church tradition. A way to take some of the pressure off the need to form this other kind of group is simply to decriminalize. Then if you want to be a church, you can be a church, but you can have the same legal protection, roughly the same legal protection, without having to claim to be a church. It gets tricky if you need to import your sacrament. State-level decrim, local deprioritization does not give you a cross-border import permit.
I think some people see an opportunity in the kind of radical jurisprudence we've seen from the Supreme Court around religious freedom, that they're defining it in very broad ways, that many lawyers I've talked to think when the right case comes along for a new psychedelic church, it'll be very hard for Sam Alito, who's written a lot of those opinions, to say that's not a church and that's not a sacrament, because they've already said, who's the government to say? And they've defined religious freedom so broadly. I think that's one of the reasons. But I think the other thing you're pointing to is that, one of the issues in psychedelics has been the idea of a safe container, and that this is a powerful substance that needs a container. And we know the medical container. We know what it looks like. And it has enormous benefits, but it also has problems. And that religions, organized religions, offer a container. As you said, they offer community, ritual. Andy Weil has written, and this has really stayed with me, that people who use drugs in a ceremonial way, in a ritual way, don't get in trouble with them to the same extent that people who don't. And this applies even to alcohol. I mean, people who only drink socially, who only drink in the evening or with food or whatever, or obey these kind of rules we have around alcohol. And religion gives you that. Religion gives you a set of rituals and ceremonies that has a certain safety factor built in. It's not sure fire, but it's there. Hunt Priest, who's speaking right now, I think, so he's not in the room. He is an Episcopal priest who participated in the religious leaders study, and he had a wonderful quote, or I should say a provocative quote, which is that he thought psychedelics have a lot to offer the Christian church, and at the same time the church has a lot to offer the psychedelic community. And I think that's a really powerful idea and worth exploring. And I think he's onto something. What religion has to offer the church, he would say, is a kind of reinvigoration of spirituality. As churches have gotten too much in the head and not enough about body experience, as churches have gotten too concerned with dogma, people are fleeing, and psychedelic experience offers an opportunity to recharge this, mystical core. So I think that's one of the most exciting things to watch right now. What's going to happen between religion and psychedelics, and I think it's something to keep an eye on.
It's going to be utterly fascinating, and I've come to realize that the best people to explore that path are the people who are already inside of the religions.
Yeah, that's right.
Rather than the outside. So I'm not talking very much about that anymore.
Yeah, well, I think that this, we see this here today. I mean, there have been several panels on religion, and that this virus has been introduced into the bloodstream of many of these mainstream religions. And what's going to happen is anyone's guess. There could be a reaction against it, an immune reaction, because direct experience of the divine is a threat to priesthoods and institutions, or can be. Or it may produce a renewal, a reformation. We'll see how you feel about that word. That's a little strong.
Again, leave it to the historians. Aldous Huxley wrote a piece in one of the then now defunct weeklies in the late 1950s. Pardon the gender title. It was Drugs That Change Men's Minds. And he talked about what he reckoned could be a very broad cultural renewal. Let's use that word. He thought that these were very, very powerful. There's a wonderful opportunity to reintroduce them, or to introduce them in wholesome ways. He thought it would be of immense importance, covering basically every aspect of life. And then I'm going to paraphrase what he said. How the churches will deal with this, I'm not able to predict. But if they don't engage with it, then this phenomenon of immense importance will take place outside their walls.
Yeah, that's a powerful idea. So, let's talk a little bit about this idea of belief change. This is something we've talked about a few times before. There is an idea at large in the community that psychedelics change people's beliefs in a positive direction. There's some very sketchy research to support this, that nature connectedness scores go up after a single psilocybin experience, that tolerance for authoritarianism goes up. And this is
Goes down.
I'm sorry, goes down. Yeah, thank you. This is the kind of editing we count on. kind of, this feels right to me in some sense, but I also realize that we haven't validated it in any way, and it might not be right at all. And this is an area of, going back to this idea of areas of exuberance that we're throwing a wet blanket on today. But I mean, it seems to me we need to test it, and most of the people we ask this question are probably already inclined to be environmentalists, already inclined not to tolerate authoritarianism. But what do you think about that? I mean, it seems to me a rich area for research.
Yeah, totally. Not only are the people who volunteer for the studies more likely to be open to begin with and more susceptible to connectedness and increased connectedness, I'm just guessing, most of the researchers are already pretty elevated on the scales. And we know there are social effects. We don't know how the transmission occurs. It doesn't take a researcher who's actually coaching and volunteer. It could just be the presence of the person who leads in that direction. Calls to mind a paper from maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, long title containing the word political pluripotency. Very well written paper, although I'm not sure that I totally agree with the ultimate assertion. The ultimate assertion, if I got it right, if you're wrong, is that a strong psychedelic experience leading to mystical type, ego dissolution, whatever you want to call it, experience, is actually entirely value neutral. And whether or not it leads to allegedly positive changes or allegedly negative ones, and by the way, those are often value judgments, they're not absolutes. Totally, 100%, depends on setting. William Benny Eisner would have the word matrix as another conversation.
This is kind of Stan Groff's idea, right? That it's an unspecific mental amplifier rather than it's loaded in one direction or another.
Yeah, correct. And I suspect that's not right. Roland and I have talked about it. We do from time to time. He agrees. And come on, if you have this sense of interconnectedness with all living things, how could you not care more about all living things? So I buy into that as an overstuffed armchair idea, but it's not strongly to test. But I think it's interesting to contemplate what would happen if it were true. If it is true that it's totally non-specific, then it matters all the more what is the set, what is the setting, and what is the matrix. A few words about matrix. There was a clinical psychologist who did work decades ago, and she wanted to emphasize the social aspect of setting. She was doing residential treatment with people who had come to live in like a shared household setting. So they fly away from their home to the treatment area for a while, and there for anything that's up a month, 2 months, and fly home. And her point was, the long-term effectiveness of the treatment or the intervention depends a lot on where they came from. There's what happens when they leave it, but they go back to the old family, the old relationships, and the old job. And the old patterns, that's right. And my sense is there's a social homeostasis, which when you go back home, it's hard to break out of. Everything is pulling you back to your old you.
Yeah.
So if we think that nature-relatedness, a sense of interconnectedness is a good thing, we can ask ourselves in a generative fashion, how can we shift the matrices? I'll take it a step further. The culturally carried narratives, and by that I mean the water we swim in. The fish doesn't know water. What are the stories that are baked into our daily life? Like, if I don't have a good job, I'll starve. There's not enough to go around. If I don't strive to win, I'm going to lose big time. Not everyone can win. And there's reason to have those concerns. But it's kind of an unspoken narrative. What if we were able to shift the narrative through imaginative storytelling that's like reality-based? These are believable stories where everyone can win. It might be that there would then be more naturally a positive bias that would occur in the strong ego dissolution experience. We would generate a cultural positive bias, or have the one that's even intrinsic if it is intrinsic.
Yeah, of course, we're generating that positive bias in the medical context all the time.
Yeah.
We're trying to help cure you. That's where we're going. And we're trying to change your mind in toward a certain direction. But it's funny, it has a different valence when you talk about it. We're trying to make you an environmentalist. We're brainwashing you. Suddenly, even if it's, let's say we get the research that suggests we can nudge people in a socially positive direction to deal with the environmental crisis. Let's stick with that example. That could be very controversial, and that could produce a backlash.
It could.
So how do you research that? I guess you start out with a more politically representative or diverse sample, right? Than we probably are using right now. That would be very interesting in and of itself.
That'll happen in time. I would stick to measures that look at things that most people will agree is probably positive or it's not a bad thing. Nature connectedness, compassion. I'll go back to the Abrahamic reference, like the Ten Commandments. What are things that lead to forgiveness and generosity and compassion? And if we could just show significant progress in those domains, those basic human pro-social domains,
and that are non-ideological.
Well, they're ideological, but like universally positive ideological. Then I think we're probably at a safer track.
That's like the domain of openness too. We have done a little bit of testing on it. Nobody seems to object to being more open.
Yeah, but they probably should. I think there is such a thing as too much openness.
Too much openness?
And there's a word for it. Gullibility. And we need only look to some fringes of the New Age movement to wonder how much openness is there and how much openness is actually healthy.
Okay, on that highly contrarian note, I want to thank you all for being here and thank Bob.